The night was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made the wind sound louder than it should, the kind that carried an eerie weight, warning of something coming. Deep in the Mexican countryside, an abandoned airstrip lay forgotten, its cracked pavement covered in weeds, its hangars rusting from years of neglect. It was supposed to be a ghost of the past, a place where nothing happened anymore. But that night, headlights cut through the darkness like knives, the rumble of engines shattering the stillness. A convoy of black SUVs rolled onto the runway, their tires crunching against the gravel, their passengers stepping out with an air of control. The men moved with purpose, rifles slung over their shoulders, tattoos creeping up their arms like shadows. They were part of the most feared cartel in the region, and they had plans for this place. To them, this airstrip was a gold mine. Remote, isolated, and perfect for smuggling operations, it was the ideal location to move their shipments without interference. No police, no military, just miles of open land to use as they pleased. They laughed, celebrating their new base, confident that no one would stand in their way. But what they didn't know, what no one had told them, was that someone still lived there. The caretaker had been there for years, unnoticed, blending into the land like the trees and the dirt roads. To the outside world, he was just an old man tending to a forgotten piece of history. A quiet presence that no one questioned. But he was no ordinary caretaker. He had once been an Air Force commander, a man who had seen more battles than these cartel members could imagine. He had spent his life mastering the art of war, commanding missions that had taken him to the most dangerous corners of the world. And though his uniform had been packed away for years, he had never forgotten how to fight. Inside a small shack near the edge of the airstrip, the commander sat in the dim glow of a lantern, sipping his coffee as he watched the convoy arrive. His sharp eyes took in every detail, the number of men, the weapons they carried, the way they moved. He had seen their kind before, men who thought they owned the world because they carried guns. He set his cup down, his fingers steady as they brushed against the worn handle of his old sidearm. He had no doubt about what was coming next. The cartel moved fast, wasting no time staking their claim. They unloaded crates from the vehicles, setting up makeshift stations, barking orders to one another. Some of them laughed, already celebrating their takeover. One man, clearly in charge, stepped onto the cracked pavement and looked around with satisfaction. "This is ours now," he declared, lighting a cigarette. "No one's gonna stop us here." But deep in the shadows, the commander watched, unseen, unmoving. His mind worked quickly, analyzing the situation. He had spent his career planning missions, taking down threats much bigger than this. And he knew one thing for certain: these men had made a grave mistake. They had chosen the wrong place. As the night stretched on, the cartel continued their work, oblivious to the presence watching them. They had no idea that the ground they stood on still belonged to someone else. No idea that their every move was being noted by a man who had spent his life outsmarting enemies just like them. The commander remained calm, patient, waiting for the right moment. He wasn't reckless. He knew he couldn't take them head-on, not yet. But he had an advantage they didn't. He knew this land, every inch of it, every hidden tunnel, every blind spot, every way in and out. And he had no intention of letting them keep it. The first sign of trouble came just before dawn. One of the cartel guards patrolling the edge of the airstrip stopped, frowning. Something was off. He turned, scanning the area, but saw nothing. Just the same empty land, the same abandoned buildings. Shaking his head, he took a step forward, and then he was gone. A silent hand had pulled him into the shadows, and not a sound was heard. One by one, little things started happening. A truck's engine wouldn't start. A crate of weapons went missing. A power generator short-circuited. At first, the cartel dismissed it as bad luck. But as the night wore on, unease began to creep in. The men started looking over their shoulders, gripping their weapons tighter. Then, just as the sun was beginning to rise, they found the first body. One of their own, unconscious, tied up and left near the hangar. A message was carved into the dirt beside him. Asterisk, asterisk, leave now. Asterisk, asterisk. Her mother's eyes flicked toward the shattered window, the fear in them unmistakable. Alina saw it now. The years of silence, the half-truths, it had all been for one reason. Not to protect themselves, but to protect asterisk her asterisk. Alina's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to run, to demand answers. But deep down, she already knew the truth. You could have told me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Her mother's face softened, guilt flickering in her tired eyes. We wanted to give you a chance at a normal life. We thought if we stayed quiet, they would forget about us, about you. Alina's gaze darted back to her father, her mind racing. What did you do? What were you trying to hide? He glanced at the masked figures, who still stood silently in the background, their presence a chilling reminder that the danger hadn't passed. His voice was low when he finally spoke. There's a file, he said. A list of names, people tied to the group. People they couldn't afford to expose. I was supposed to destroy it, but I kept it. I thought if anything ever happened to me, someone needed to know the truth. Alina's heart hammered harder. The answers she had been chasing for so long were finally within reach. But they had come at a cost, trust broken, lies destroyed, and a family shattered by secrets. Where is it? She asked, her voice steady now. Her father's eyes locked onto hers, something fragile flickering beneath the guilt. I left it with someone I trusted. Someone who's been watching over you without you ever knowing. Alina's mind spun, trying to piece together who it could be, until Jack stepped forward. No, she whispered, realization crashing over her. Jack's gaze met hers, his face lined with regret. I never meant to lie to you, Lilina. I was just trying to keep you safe, the same way your father asked me to. Alina's heart cracked. The one person she had trusted through everything had been part of the lie all along. But even as the betrayal burned inside her, she saw the truth in his eyes. He had been protecting her, even when she didn't know she needed protecting. Her father's voice broke the silence. You don't have to carry this, Alina. You can walk away. No one would blame you. Alina's hands clenched into fists. For years, she had been chasing answers, trying to uncover the truth buried beneath the lies. Now the truth was staring her in the face, dangerous, heavy, and impossible to ignore. I'm not walking away, she said quietly. I deserve to know everything. And if they want to bury the truth, then I'll be the one to expose it. Her father's eyes filled with something that looked like both fear and pride. Jack's gaze lingered on her, his face pale, but he nodded. They'll never stop coming, her mother warned, her voice trembling. Then let them, Alina said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm not afraid anymore. The storm outside began to calm, the winds fading into distant whispers. The masked figures exchanged brief glances, then slowly retreated into the shadows without a word, vanishing as silently as they had come. Alina stood in the wreckage of everything she had once believed, but for the first time in her life, she felt steady. The truth had broken her, but it had also set her free. Her father stepped forward, his eyes glistening. I'm so sorry, Alina. She didn't answer. Not yet. There were still too many wounds that couldn't be healed with apologies alone. But as she looked at him, at the broken man who had once been her hero, she saw the flicker of the man he used to be buried beneath the years of fear and regret. "We'll find the file," she said finally. "Together." Her father's breath caught, and for a brief moment, the years of distance between them seemed to melt away. The night stretched on, the storm leaving behind only the faint scent of rain and the promise of a new beginning. As the first light of dawn broke through the shattered window, Alina stood at the edge of everything she had ever known. The world outside was still dangerous, still full of secrets waiting to be unearthed. But this time she wasn't running. This time she was ready. No more lies, no more hiding. The truth would come out, no matter what it cost. Them? Alina echoed, her heart hammering as the pieces started to fall into place. Who are they? Her mother hesitated, glancing at the masked figures who stood still, silent. The ones who've been watching us for years. The ones who made your father disappear. But why? Why would they? Alina, your father wasn't just an ordinary man. He was part of something, a secret group working with powerful people. People who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. I was a part of it too. But when he tried to get out, her mother paused, her face suddenly tight with emotion. He made a deal. And that's why they came for him. Jack, still struggling with the masked figure who held him, suddenly broke free, rushing toward Alina. "It's true," he said, panting. "Your father wasn't just running from his past. He was trying to protect you. He knew they would come after you if they ever figured out who you were." Alina's mind was reeling. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Her father had been trying to protect her. Her mother had been lying to her. And Jack, her closest ally, was tied up in all of this. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. The storm outside had intensified even more, but this was no natural storm. Alina realized, with a jolt of panic, that the walls of the house were shaking, the ground beneath her feet rumbling. The masked figures had stopped, their eyes flicking nervously toward the door. One of them whispered, "It's happening." Before Alina could process what that meant, the front door exploded inward, sending shards of wood and debris flying across the room. Standing in the doorway, framed by the harsh light of the storm, was a man, familiar, yet terrifying. It was her father. But he wasn't the same man she remembered. His eyes were wild, his face gaunt, as though years of torment had taken their toll. He stepped into the room, his hands outstretched, his voice booming through the chaos. "Enough," he shouted. "It ends now." Her mother took a step back, her face pale with shock, as her father moved toward them. But the look in his eyes wasn't one of reconciliation. It was cold, calculating. He glanced at Alina, and for the first time in years, she saw the man who had once been her hero, her protector. But now he was something else. "You don't know the full truth, Alina," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I made the wrong choice. But I had no choice. It's too late to fix what I've done." In an instant, everything shifted. The figures in black, her mother, Jack, everything she thought she knew about her father's disappearance was a lie. The truth wasn't just buried, it was weaponized. And then, just as her father took a step toward her, his eyes no longer filled with remorse, but with a chilling sense of finality, everything went black again. This time, though, Alina knew it wasn't the storm that had caused it. It was something much worse. The storm inside her own life had only just begun. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. Alina's heart pounded in her chest as the darkness wrapped around her. The air felt colder, as if the weight of everything she had just learned was pressing down on her. Somewhere in the distance, the house creaked under the wind's pressure. Her father's voice still echoed in her ears, fractured, filled with regret. Slowly, the lights flickered back on, casting shaky shadows across the broken room. Alina's eyes darted between the faces around her. Her mother stood frozen, her breath shallow. Jack leaned against the wall, clutching his bruised arm, while the masked figures remained motionless, waiting for a signal. Her father's presence loomed, his eyes fixed on Alina. For a moment, no one spoke. The storm seemed to howl louder, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "Alina," he said softly, his voice strained. "I never wanted you to see any of this." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Then why did you leave? Why did you lie to me?" His face broke, the years of pain and secrecy unraveling in his expression. "Because I knew what would happen if they ever found you. If they knew who you really were, what you could expose." Alina's pulse quickened. The pieces were finally coming together, the hidden documents, the strange warnings, the way her mother had always kept her at arm's length. She had been caught in the middle of something far bigger than she ever realized. "You're not the only one they were protecting," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "They've been watching you your entire life, waiting to see if you'd follow the trail your father left behind." Flames roared to life, heat surging through the air as the fuel ignited. The explosion sent a shockwave through the airstrip, shaking the ground beneath them. Soldiers shouted, scrambling away from the blaze. Panic spread fast. The commander didn't wait. He moved in the chaos, taking them down one by one with quick, calculated strikes. A rifle butt to the temple, a knife across the arm, a chokehold from the darkness. He didn't kill. Not yet, but he made sure they felt it. By the time the flames settled, 3 men were down, groaning in pain. The others were rattled, backing away. Rojas arrived moments later, fury in his eyes as he took in the scene. His men were shaken, scared. The fire had destroyed part of their supplies, and now they were second-guessing every step they took. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He turned to Chavez, his voice sharp. "Tell me you have something." Chavez hesitated. "This guy, he's not just some caretaker. He's trained. Military, maybe special forces. He knows exactly what he's doing." Rojas clenched his fists. He had underestimated his opponent. That wouldn't happen again. "Then we stop playing games," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We find him. We end this." But even as he spoke, he knew deep down, this wasn't going to be easy. The caretaker wasn't running. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting for them to make their next mistake. The night air was thick with smoke and tension. The explosion had rattled the cartel's grip on the airstrip, but it hadn't broken them. Not yet. Rojas paced near the burning wreckage, his mind racing. Every second they spent standing around, the caretaker was out there, watching, planning. They had walked into his trap, and now he was picking them apart, one by one. Chavez stood beside him tense. "We can't keep taking losses like this," he muttered. "He's got the advantage. He knows the land better than we do." Rojas exhaled sharply, his jaw clenched. "Then we take away his advantage." He turned to his men, his voice hard. "Sweep the perimeter. Find where he's hiding. If he wants to play ghost, we flush him out." The soldiers moved in groups, sweeping the airstrip, the buildings, the surrounding trees. The caretaker watched from a distance, his breath steady, his heart calm. They were growing desperate. That was good. Desperate men made mistakes. He needed just one more opening. Moving with precision, he slipped through the shadows, staying low. He spotted 2 cartel members near the maintenance hangar, scanning the area with flashlights. They were nervous, whispering to each other. He crept closer, silent as the wind, waiting for the right moment. Then, in a flash, he struck. A quick blow to the first man's throat, cutting off his breath. A sharp twist of the second man's wrist, making him drop his weapon. Before they could react, he had them both unconscious, dragged into the darkness. He took one of their radios and listened. Rojas was barking orders, his frustration growing. "I want him found. We don't leave this place until his body is in front of me." The caretaker allowed himself a small smile. Good, let them focus on hunting him. They were too distracted to see what was really happening. Back at the main building, Rojas was restless. Every minute that passed without results made his men more uneasy. He needed to regain control. And then he had an idea. He turned to Chaves. "If we can't find him, we make him come to us." Chaves frowned. "How?" Rojas looked at the remaining hostages, 2 airstrip workers the cartel had captured earlier. They had been left alive, tied up inside one of the storage buildings. They were the only civilians left, the only leverage they had. Rojas pulled his knife and walked toward the hostages. He didn't have to say anything. Chaves knew what was coming. "He'll come for them," Rojas said, his voice cold. "And when he does, we finish this." The caretaker had been watching from a distance, hidden in the darkness, his grip tightening on his weapon. He heard everything, saw everything. They wanted to lure him out. They thought he would make a mistake, that he would act out of desperation. But they had made a mistake, too. They thought they were the ones setting the trap. They had no idea they had just walked into his. The storm raged outside, its howling winds battering against the windows. But inside the small, dimly lit room, the tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. Alina, her hands shaking as she grasped the letter, could feel her heart hammering against her chest. She had thought the truth about her father's disappearance was already dark enough. Hidden secrets, betrayal, and an elusive past that never quite fit. But now, as she scanned the final, chilling words on the page, a new layer of dread unfurled. Her father hadn't just vanished. He had been taken asterisk. Continue the story from the previous section and write that explore the main conflict in depth. Develop subplots and dive into different angles or perspectives, but keep the tension building. Don't resolve any of the major conflicts yet, and keep the suspenseful tone while ensuring the story remains engaging. Use relevant keywords naturally. Also, do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also don't create violated content, which can affect YouTube policy. Chaves led the group toward the caretaker's house, his grip tightening around his rifle. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made even hardened men glance over their shoulders. He could feel it, the presence of someone watching. The silence wasn't natural. It was controlled, intentional. They were walking into something, but they didn't know what. Rojas's order echoed in Chavez's mind. Burn it down. Send a message. But Chavez wasn't stupid. Messages like that had a way of backfiring, especially when you didn't know who you were dealing with. A man who could take out one of their own without a trace wasn't just some squatter. He was trained, dangerous, maybe even military. The house itself was barely standing, weathered wood, peeling paint, an old metal roof that had seen better days. But there was something about it that made Chaves pause. It wasn't abandoned. The footprints in the dirt were fresh. Someone had been coming and going. And if the caretaker had been living here all these years, then he knew this place better than anyone. That meant traps. He raised a hand, signaling the others to stop. "Check for tripwires," he muttered. "We go slow." One of the men scoffed, stepping forward with reckless confidence. "It's just an old house man. What's he gonna do?" A second later, there was a sharp click beneath the man's boot. Everyone froze. "Don't move," Chaves said, his heart pounding. The man's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The others backed away. The commander had rigged the place. Chavis scanned the ground, spotting the barely visible wire leading from the man's boot to a small, buried charge. It wasn't big, probably not enough to kill, but enough to take off a leg. A warning, a reminder that they weren't in control here. Chavis swallowed hard, waving another soldier forward to disarm the trap. It took a few tense moments, but finally the wire was cut, and the man stumbled back, his face pale. That was the moment Chaves knew for sure. The caretaker wasn't just some old man holding on to a forgotten airstrip. He was a ghost from another life, a fighter who had been left behind. And now they had forced him to fight again. Back near the airstrip, Rojas was growing impatient. He paced near the runway, eyes locked on the horizon. The longer this dragged on, the worse it looked for him. His men were starting to doubt. He could see it in their faces, the unease, the whispers. They had come here expecting easy control. Instead, they were being hunted. He needed to regain control. Call in reinforcements, he told one of his men. Tell them to bring everything. The soldier hesitated. Everything. Rojas's jaw tightened. Everything. If this ghost wanted a war, Rojas would give him one. But the commander wasn't waiting for them to bring more men. He moved through the airstrip like a shadow, using the knowledge of the land to his advantage. He had spent years preparing for something like this, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. His instincts had never dulled, his training never faded. He had built defenses, studied weak points, turned the entire airstrip into his personal battlefield. And now the fight was on his terms. He watched from a distance as the cartel soldiers regrouped near the fuel depot. A careless decision. He had seen them stack their supply of extra fuel barrels there earlier. They had no idea they were standing in the middle of a potential firestorm. A plan formed in his mind. He didn't need to take them all out, just enough to break their confidence, to make them doubt their leader. If he could fracture their unity, they would start making mistakes. And mistakes were what he thrived on. Slipping through the dark, he positioned himself near the edge of the depot, staying low, moving quietly. He counted the men. 5, maybe 6. All focused on their weapons, distracted. That was their first mistake. The commander reached into his pack, pulling out a small homemade explosive, just enough to cause chaos. With careful precision, he set the charge near the barrels and moved back, keeping to the shadows. Then, with a single press of the detonator, the night exploded into fire. The letter wasn't written by him, nor was it a message from his captors. It was a warning penned by someone else, someone who knew exactly what had happened. They're coming for you too. It read, "No one is safe, not even your mother." Elena's breath caught in her throat as the implications settled over her like a blanket of ice. Her mother had always been distant, lost in memories of a life before Elena's birth. But now she was tied to this shadowy web in ways Elena had never understood. Who were they? And why had her father hidden the truth for so long? The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking her reverie. She dropped the letter, heart racing, as she spun toward the door. No one was supposed to be here. Not tonight. Not after all that had happened. Her mind screamed at her to run, to lock herself away. But her feet stayed rooted to the spot. The handle of the door turned slowly, the creak of the hinges as the door opened sending a jolt of adrenaline straight to her core. Standing in the doorway was a figure she never thought she'd see again, Jack. But it wasn't the man she had known. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, and his lips twisted into a grim smile that sent a chill down her spine. The Jack she had once trusted, the one she had laughed with, cried with, and shared her deepest secrets with, was now something else entirely. a shadow of his former self. "Alina," he said softly, his voice trembling as if it too had been broken. "I'm so sorry." Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what was happening. Her heart screamed for answers, but the words that left her mouth were strangled, desperate. "What's going on? Who did this to my father?" Jack stepped inside, his eyes darting nervously toward the door, as if checking for someone or something. His gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. "It's not over," Jack whispered. "The worst is still to come. They haven't found her yet, but they will. And when they do, they'll come for you next." Before Alina could ask anything more, a sudden crash sounded from the far side of the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and closing in fast. Jack's face paled, his eyes wide with panic. Without another word, he lunged toward Alina, grabbing her arm. "You have to come with me now." But it was too late. The door behind them exploded inward, splintering wood flying across the room. Alina froze, her breath catching as several figures, cloaked in black, stormed in. Their faces were hidden, but their presence, cold and calculating, was undeniable. And then, as the storm outside intensified, everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Alina's body was frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend the scene unfolding around her. The black-clad figures moved swiftly through the room, their eyes hidden beneath masks, their intent clear, no mercy. Jack's grip on her arm tightened. His breath labored as he tried to pull her toward the back of the house, but the figures were too fast. One of them reached for her, a cold-gloved hand grabbing her shoulder. "No," Jack shouted, shoving the figure back, but another one quickly grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with ease. Jack winced in pain, but he didn't falter. He looked at Alina, his eyes wild, desperate. "Run," he cried, but it was too late. The figure who had grabbed Alina pulled her toward the center of the room, as the others began to circle around them. Her mind raced. She had to get away. But how? What was happening? Who were these people? And where was her mother? Everything she'd thought she knew, every piece of her father's disappearance, every whisper of truth she had pieced together, was suddenly slipping through her fingers like sand. But then, amidst the chaos, Alina saw it, something she hadn't expected. The figure who had been leading the group stepped forward, pulling off their mask. Alina gasped, her heart nearly stopped. It was her mother. "What?" Alina's voice cracked, a tremor in her words. "What are you?" Her mother's eyes, once full of distant sadness, were now filled with something darker, something colder. She didn't look like the woman Alina had known. This was someone else entirely. "Alina," her mother said, her voice eerily calm. "I didn't want you to get involved in this. But now there's no turning back." "Mom, what the hell is going on? Why did you hide the truth?" Alina's voice was shaking, a mix of anger and confusion choking her words. Her mother's lips curled into a thin, almost regretful smile. "Because I had no choice. I was trying to protect you. From them."